Chapter 7. Titus handed in the binder to his professor, feeling the weight of weeks of research and comparison notation sliding from his spirit. It hadn't been the easiest work that he had done as a student, but it had been far from the hardest. Still, in raw hours spent on various court case reviews, summaries, and making requests to official databases online for video of depositions, listening carefully for audio playback and making references to various moments in these recordings, it had resulted in something that he hadn't yet experienced in his previous 3 years as a student in the criminal justice coursework. The feeling that his efforts would prove worthwhile in the long run. This hadn't always been the case, of course. There had been many research papers that, for his liking, felt like little more than copy and paste jobs that anyone with the intellectual capacities of a monkey could complete. That didn't feel like anything worth his time and effort, particularly considering the amount of money he was going to have to pay back in student loans over the course of the next few years. At least I got a few grants in there, plus the athletics scholarships, he thought as he walked out of the lecture hall. I got it a lot better than most of these folks, he mused, looking side to side at his fellow criminal justice studies majors. Heading for the last of his classes for the day, he found himself thinking about Ashkar, wondering what exactly it was he was aiming at. While Titus wasn't naturally inclined toward cynicism, and wanted to give the older Minotaur the benefit of the doubt, there were, to say the least, a few issues of trust to be hammered out. His forensic sciences professor had once been a specialist with the New York State Police, and had been hesitant to help Titus at first with his request for background information on his biological father, but in the end, the man had relented. That morning, the professor had told Titus to watch his email inbox throughout the day, that his contacts inside the law enforcement apparatus had come through for him, and that a full report on his findings would be coming along soon. Titus had dutifully checked his inbox between classes, but thus far, nothing had come through. As he came to the end of the corridor that would lead him to his final lecture of the day, however, his phone buzzed in his pocket, and without thinking, Titus pulled it out for a quick glance. When he saw his email app's alert prompt front and center, informing him that he had a new missive in his inbox, Titus's breath caught in his throat for a moment. Don't freak out, Titus. This is exactly what you've been waiting for. Titus decided that it would be best to wait until at least he'd situated himself in his seat for the final class of the day, before even peeking at what his forensic sciences instructor had sent along to him. Once he had his laptop open in front of him in the lecture hall, Titus decided that he would at least attempt to be subtle about what he was doing, which was much more readily achieved by using the laptop itself. Connecting to the school's Wi-Fi network, he navigated through his browser client to his own email, and opened the email from Professor Caldwell. The message had 3 attachments, but Titus wanted to see what Caldwell might have added ahead of those, as commentary of his own. Mr. Jacobson, I believe you know well that I value thoroughness in all pursuits of knowledge, the message began. But you also surely know that I hold a private citizen's right to privacy to be right next to sacrosanct in all things as well. Given these things, I fear that I must offer my apologies for making certain assumptions about the nature of your relationship to the individual whose name and description you gave me to have looked into. I assume that the man in question, one Ashkar Sutek, is in fact your biological father. If I am correct in this assumption, then you have an even greater apology due to you from me. However, if I have guessed correctly regarding the nature of your connection to this man, then I offer you the following cautionary note before you go looking into the attached reports to this email. Just because this man is your father, that does not mean that you will end up anything like him. It is my firm belief that your future is yours and yours alone to determine. You have been an astute student, and you quite possibly have a dynamic athletic career ahead of you, depending on where your focus lies in this last year of your education. I say last year because, much as I enjoy you in my class, Mr. Jacobson, And though you are certainly not struggling to pass the class, I don't foresee you maintaining the patience required for 2 more years of study in a laboratory setting to become a fully accredited forensics specialist. I mean no offense by this either, Mr. Jacobson. Titus let out one quiet snort of appreciation and humor, then opened the first of the attachments to the email. When he began reading through the initial NCID file for one Ashkar Sutek, he wasn't much surprised to find that his father's record included a few violent incidents in his first few years after the official registration as a citizen of the United States in the 1970s. After all, there were plenty of Minotaurs, lizardmen, hobgoblins, and even a few Kenin, the dogmen of Chaldea, who ran afoul of Earthside authorities. Some habits and cultural practices were simply hardwired, and the older members of each of these races, as well as the Gotrin, or Ratmen, struggled more than most to break those patterns of behavior. What Titus found upsetting was that Ashkar continued to have legal issues into and throughout the 1980s and 90s as well, however. In several of the incidents to which he was named as a party, his wife, suspected, though never officially registered with any U.S. government agency or department as legally married, Vela was also present. However, her name ceased altogether to come up in bullet-pointed notes on Ashkar's records at some point in the mid-90s. Curious, Titus thought, closing the file for the time being and moving on to the second attachment. His final class's professor had only just arrived, and the big man knew that it would take said professor at least a good 5 or 6 minutes before the session proper began. The second attachment was headlined, The State of New York v. Ashkar Sutek, September 8th, 2000. Titus skimmed over the text on the first page, but felt relatively certain he understood now what had happened to him when he was just a few years old. Ashkar, his mate Vela having passed away a couple of years earlier, had been forced into the position of being the primary and lone guardian for little Titus. Given his history of working in the gray area of the economy, Ashkar had tried to work a handful of jobs that would give him big enough scores that he wouldn't be forced into looking into daycare for his son, or seeking the sort of assistance programs that single parents could apply for when they had been rendered single parents through no fault of their own. Ashkar had not, after all, asked for God to strike his mate dead in that incident. Without any family or friends to turn Titus over to for even a few hours' time to watch over, while he went and, according to the file, broke into an ATM through brute force in order to claim the cash within for himself, Ashkar had instead left his son in the emergency room waiting area at Erie County Medical Center. But Ashkar had not counted on there being a heavy police presence in the area where he had chosen to hit up that ATM. He hadn't counted on getting shot nearly a dozen times before losing consciousness due to blood loss and being medically removed from the scene to the very same hospital where his son sat waiting for his dad to show back up. Ashkar hadn't counted on a nurse recognizing the inbound criminal suspect with 10 bullet wounds and massive bleeding as the same adult who had left a minor-aged Minotaur child in the waiting area just an hour earlier. Nor had Ashkar counted on that nurse contacting the state's Child Protective Services and Social Services to come collect the child. When Titus closed the second attachment, he realized that his professor had been speaking for at least a few minutes, and he had caught none of what the man had been saying. "Lynn? Hon? Can we have the room?" John asked, as Thursday night football rolled into the commercials to start halftime. Titus felt his shoulders tighten up. He knew that tone, and so too did his mother, who nimbly but gracefully swept herself up to her feet and made a quick shuffle out to the kitchen, putting in her earbuds while she prepared herself and her boys a little snack for when the game came back on. Whatever it was her husband had to say to their son, John didn't want her overhearing it. It had been just like this when he'd had to have the birds and the bees talk with Titus, and the poor kid had done nothing but blush every time he looked in his mother's direction for almost a week. What's up, Dad?" Titus asked, his nerves jangling. When he met his dad's eyes, however, his nervousness vanished as if naught but a ghost's call on an evening breeze. It was nervous concern in John's eyes that looked back at him. "I don't know, son. You tell me." "There's been this... I don't know," John began quietly, shaking his head and shrugging his shoulders. "This pissed mist coming off of you since yesterday when you got home. Don't tell me it's nothing, because I'll be forced to call bullshit on you." He waggled a finger at the young Minotaur, but not with any kind of malice or anger. "I know you, son. Whatever is eating you, I want to try to help." Titus rubbed at the scruff at the back of his neck awkwardly, unsure of how to proceed precisely. "I'm not good with this kind of thing, Dad," he said. "You know, talking through stuff." "Most men aren't as a rule, Titus. It kind of goes against our nature," John replied with a sheepish grin. "We do things. We solve problems. Talking about stuff? We tend to write that off as either feminine or egghead methodology. That's how God made us, to balance one another like that, men and women. That's why we work so well together. There's good reason for it, even if we don't always understand it. But even guys gotta talk through this stuff now and again, and I think that whatever it is that's on your mind, you need to talk about it." Titus appreciated what his dad was trying to do, to offer him an outlet. The challenge boiled down effectively to the Minotaur being uncertain how exactly to phrase what it was that he'd been feeling since he finished reading through all of the attachments that he'd been sent regarding his birth father's background. He'd already dealt with the knowledge that Ashkar had been a criminal and a thug, which were things that the man had effectively admitted to already during that first lunch sit-down that they'd had. A brute he might have been, yes, but Ashkar Sutek had not told any bit of a lie during that conversation, not directly. What Titus found himself grappling with was not even that Ashkar had been arrested, charged and convicted of attempted theft from the ATM near ECMC. These things didn't make him like or sympathize with the man any more than he might have otherwise, but they weren't the most damning factor, or why Titus worried that the next time Ashkar came around to visit, he might just say hello with a punch to the man's face. "Okay, it's like this, Dad," he began. "I already told you that my, father has had a somewhat colorful history since coming to Earth during the Outworld incident. And before it, back in his homeworld, from what I remember you telling me," John added. "Yeah, that too. Well, the thing is, I decided I wanted to learn a little bit more about all of that from an official source. I roped in a favor from one of my professors who still has connections in law enforcement." John didn't prod, waiting patiently for Titus to provide more. "He told me already that he got pinched for charges while we were at ECMC, where the state's people found and took me in." John nodded. "Well, he got charged and convicted for destruction of property and attempted grand larceny at that time. He got locked up, and since then, he's pretty much been a foggy figure somewhere in the backstage area of my life." "Which makes perfectly good sense, given those kinds of charges," John said. "Yeah, but that's the thing, Dad," Titus said, slumping forward in his seat a little, cradling his face in his hands, fingertips twerking faintly into the crown of his forehead. "He got out on parole after 6 years. He did just 6 years, and then he was out on a year of probation." Titus slowly sat up, letting himself ease back into the couch cushions. "I was only 12 years old when he got out and off of probation. He could have come and seen me then, Dad, but he didn't. Titus felt his hands curling into fists on his lap, felt the tightening of his jaw. He went about his life again. Not a thought or a care in the world for the kid that he'd left behind while he got hauled off to pay for being such a piece of shit. Titus snorted, palms beginning to sting as his fingernails threatened to bite into them from the pressure of balling his hands up. John Jacobson would never be described by any of his peers, family members, or even his loving wife as the best or surest man of faith. He rarely led prayer at meals, accepted that his reticence to be part of any kind of crowd had kept his family from going to regular service on Sundays, or even from most special holiday services, and he didn't quote scripture in the same way that Linda could when she felt the occasion called for it. But John had his moments. Paul said to let all bitterness, wrath, and anger be put aside from you, son. Yes, Ashkar made the poor choice of not coming to see his offspring when he had the chance, the Jacobson patriarch said, a gentle smile spreading warmth across his own face and Titus's heart. But your mom and I benefited from that bad decision. Remember, Titus, Ashkar took himself from your life, but God put you into ours. Titus just blinked intermittently to himself for a moment, staring at the TV, taking in John's words. By the time the Thursday night game ended and Titus headed up to bed for the night, he no longer felt the urge to hit anything, other than the pillow, with his head. O'Connell paced back and forth, hands on his hips, his face a storm of fear and anger by the time Ashkar locked the bar's front door behind him. Criminy, O'Connell, you look like a recovering junkie who just watched his buddy flush a stash of China White, the Minotaur said with his trademark lack of tact. What the hell's the matter with you? The Hume ceased his persistent pacing and gave Ashkar a quizzical look, flapped a hand at him, and muttered something under his breath. We got a visit coming from the health inspector or something? Nay, nothing like that, Ash. Something a fair bit more troublesome. The Hume finally planted his hands widely on the bar, looking across at his bouncer/handyman/crony, his jaw clenched tight. It's that blast rod I had you go get for me. Blast rod? Oh, wait, you mean that wand thing? Aye, just the same. Well, turns out that it was never supposed to be up for auction in the first place, silent auction or otherwise. It belonged to someone who didn't want to part with it, regardless of the sum offered for its purchase. And now that someone has gone sniffing around in the old stomping grounds. How'd you hear about this? Ashkar made himself more comfortable for this conversation by hauling himself up onto one of the stools at the bar, leaning his broad arms on the scarred surface. Mickey Sullivan called me this morning in a fit of tizzy, barking about some sort of man-rat waking him up this morning with a knife pressed against the soft underside of his jaw, asking after where the rod ended up. Ashkar felt his own guts tighten up a touch. Sullivan had been the man who handled putting in the bid on and then ultimately collecting the rod from its grey market auction and then handing it over to Ashkar to bring to O'Connell in the long run. There weren't a lot of middle persons to go between in order to track the blast rod down. I didn't see any Gotrin when I went on that little retrieval run for you, the Minotaur thug said with a grunt. Then again, they have a tendency to stay small and out of the way until it's time to do something for themselves. Was he able to tell you anything particular about this rat? Markings or scars? Anything of that nature? O'Connell's initial response was to give Ashkar a dour look. The man had a knife stuck up under his throat, Do you really think he was trying to be careful, accounting of what his would-be murderer looked like? Besides, all of those rodents look alike. Way to buck those old accusations that you're a racist, buddy. You know what the fuck I mean. Now's not the time to be a wise-ass, Ash, O'Connell snapped, slapping the bar countertop. I've got to figure out a safe place to stash the damned thing for now, and my place won't do. Neither, for that matter, will yours. Anyone who comes sniffing around will figure out pretty quick that you work for me. Ashkar thought up a solution almost immediately, though he only had one half of the suggestion figured out at the moment. The second half would take just a little bit of consideration. I know where I can go for safekeeping, for a little while at least, the Minotaur said. Give me some coffee and a little bit of time to think things through, and I should have it squared away. Titus read through the text message again, trying to think about how he might want to respond to it. Titus, I know I just reconnected with you, but I have some traditions of the old way that I must tend to, which requires that I head out of town for a few days at least. I don't much trust the neighbors around here, though, and I have something that I would feel better about entrusting to your safekeeping while I'm away. Please get back to me as soon as you can. I'll have to head out by sunset today. He didn't like the idea of a running clock, for starters. Secondly, if he agreed to help Ashkar by holding on to whatever it was that he wanted Titus to safeguard, what guarantees did Titus have that the object in question, regardless of what it was something that legitimately belonged to Ashkar in the first place? Titus started his truck, took a sip of coffee from his travel thermos, and backed slowly out of his parents' driveway, heading off to campus for the day. By the time he arrived to find his favorite parking space actually available for the first time in almost 2 weeks, Titus had come to a decision. I have no classes from noon to 1 again today, he typed. Come meet me at the football field, and we can talk over my possibly doing you this favor. His dad's words from the prior evening kept playing over and over in his head. Let all anger be set aside from you, he thought, settling into his seat for his forensic sciences lecture. I may not be able to set it all aside, big guy, but I can at least try. When his eyes fell upon the dark wooden box that Ashkar was carrying under one muscular arm toward him, Titus instantly found himself wondering if a member of law enforcement, himself not counting since he was just a student of the field, not a working member of it, was currently waiting for the right moment to pounce on the older but smaller Minotaur. Mindful to keep himself as neutral and composed as possible outwardly, he kept his thumbs hooked in the pockets of his oversized jeans until Ashkar came to within arm's reach. Your mother and I didn't always see eye to eye on things, son, Ashkar began, bringing the little box up and around so that he was holding it from underneath with both hands. It was a nice enough little wooden box from what Titus could tell of such things, but more than the box itself, he could feel something throbbing from within it, a dull kind of hum that seemed to not quite hit the ears, but the mind itself. It was the same feeling, he realized, that he sometimes got when Misha's father would perform one of the more powerful spells in his arsenal of illusion magics. For instance, she was relatively comfortable with artifacts, relics, and all things to do with spellcraft, especially back, home. Well, was she a mage? No, not by any stretch, though she had some minor capabilities with ritual spells. Little things, like being able to tamp down your fevers when you were still really tiny, or easing the pain in my hands if I got into a tussle. Nothing extraordinary, but certainly more than anything me or anyone else on my side of your bloodline ever managed. A quirk of his lips gave Ashkar a momentarily perturbed expression. Except for maybe your great-uncle Tanoa. He was a shaman. But he also tried to marry a chicken, so that's not exactly a ringing endorsement for the whole realm of woo-woo shit. Anyway, this was something that your mother picked up along the way during our jobs as mercs, back before the incident. Titus was about to take the top off of the box, but a question popped into his head before putting his hands on it. Where was this when you were locked up? How'd you end up getting it back? Look, I knew that I was going to screw up eventually, or at least end up with some heat breathing down my neck after Vela passed. So I made an arrangement with one of the last guys from our old crew who was still alive and kicking here. Guy who'd turned completely legitimate long before I did. I asked him if he'd hold on to it for me, wrangled an oath out of him. A hobgoblin, then, Titus said, not making it a question, but a statement. Despite his distaste for such a tactic, he found himself grinning at his biological father's cunning. That's low, Ashkar, but I think I understand why you did it. Titus took the sides of the box's lid, and as he lifted it, he saw within a curious object. It looked at first glance like an ocarina, with a fat metal rod rammed through its center. Upon closer inspection, however, as he took it out of the box, Titus realized that it was all crafted of a single piece of some kind of wood, the likes of which he didn't recognize. What is it? It's a blasting rod, Ashkar said, shifting the box back and forth to indicate that Titus should put the rod back inside. Titus did so, and Ashkar put the lid on and handed the whole thing over to him. It's all I really have left of your mother's, so I didn't want to risk having it stolen while I'm out of town. These pilgrimage rituals are a pain in the ass that way, but I've only missed doing it the one time while I was locked up. So it's not an annual thing? No, it's every 5 years or so. And, it's about that time. Tell you the truth, it's actually not even that. It's supposed to be once every 5 years after a man takes his first bed to mate. I would explain the whole thing, but we'd be here until well after sunset, and I need to get moving. Ashkar emphasized this by doing just that, turning and starting away toward the parking area, just off to one side of the athletics building. When are you going to be back? Titus called after him. Should only be a week or two. I'll text you when I'm on my way back, Ashkar replied, then turned and left no more room for conversation. He had accomplished what he had set out to do, after all. There was no need to hang around and pile even more lies on top of his record.